before I actually start our panel, I wanted to offer a few words of congratulations, praise and thanks to the organizers of this really fabulous World Hindu Congress. Let's give them a thank you. What they've accomplished is actually unprecedented. I can tell you that when traveling and going to literally hundreds of meetings of all kinds. But the energy, the enthusiasm, the optimism that we encounter here are absolutely unprecedented, stunning, fabulous. And actually there's a lesson for us Hindus here, because it is in this country that we, I think, have combined the atmiyata, the warmth, the caring, the compassion of what we are as a people, the openness, the pluralism, along with the efficiency, the accountability, and the meritocracy of this country, the opportunities of this country. So I also want to be here grateful, acknowledge this country and what it has done to Indians. Because outside of India, I'm told the largest number of Hindu temples anywhere in the world is in the United States of America. Let us not forget that it was Swamiji in this very land of Chicago, the Chicago area, who actually changed the narrative, right? And this combination of India and America, I think, are really crucial for the future of Hindus anywhere in the world. And I think that we have to build on this partnership and build on the energy that we have here. And I want to give just one little example of what I mean. Yesterday, all the food was laid out in the corridor. And I said, oh, it's India all over again, that, there's a bottleneck, there's a log jam, and everybody's always around the food, as you know. And I just, of course they must have felt it, but I talked to a few volunteers and I said, isn't there some way that we can shift it? And, there's a food tent outside. So this is what I mean by responsiveness, trying to solve a problem, not coexist with a problem. And I think that this is what we need to get back, to India. And this combination, I think, is going to augur well for the future of Hindu identity in the world. And this is what now brings us to the actual topic.
It's like moving from Ram Bharose to Ram Rajya.
The concept of Ram Rajya is really very profound. I was just doing some research on the archives of Raja Ram. And he has said that there are two kinds of people in the world, two kinds of civilizations. So one is the anthropomorphic, that is, it's a kind of human-centric civilization, even if it is, whatever, based on a belief in God or whatever, but it perfects itself through time, through cumulative and careful, you might say, progress. It's teleological. Okay, and there's another kind of civilization which he calls abhuman, where you want to beat time, you want to transcend time. And one is horizontal and the other is vertical. One is represented by infinity, we're going towards infinity, and the other is represented by zero. And he says, Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, we are that abhuman civilization who, through a sheer vertical ascent, want to reach the absolute. Then what about our social arrangements? So the answer is that when you have an ideal king like Ram, who is committed to serve the Praja, and you have an ideal advisor or a guru like Vashisht, then you have Ram Rajya. And what is it that has made 2014 watershed? It's a watershed. I don't know if there's an ideal guru, but you're moving towards the idea of having a dedicated and selfless ruler, etc. So we have already got deep into the topic, but the real point that I'm trying to make is that though this is in the media track, the question of Hindu identity in an era of multiculturalism and globalization is of profound importance. What does it mean to be a Hindu? This is a question that we should reflect on. We are a metaphysical and reflective and philosophical civilization, and we're constantly looking for the answer to the perennial question, who am I? You know? But what does it mean to be a Hindu in today's world? And what are the threats to our identity? I think these are the questions that we're going to talk about in this panel. And I'm going to cut short my time because, as an example of what I want my panelists to do, because I want to throw this open to all of you and hear many voices. So we're going to follow the following pattern, and I've already scrambled the order that you find here. We're going to have an initial round where each panelist will make a statement of their key points, and I'm requesting them to do this in about 6 minutes, okay? 7 minutes for Paragji, because he's sitting next to me on my right. But Paragji also has...
Are you calling me far left from?
Far and subversive left. So I'm going to come to you second last. And also after that, Kiranji, who has very kindly stepped in because, one of our panelists, TK Basu, couldn't make it. He's from Singapore. And Kiranji also has slides. So both my right wing friends have slides and my left wing friends don't have slides. So they get to go first, but only for 6 minutes. And then I'm going to sort of again scramble this up and ask them questions. So no speeches here, right? And then I'll throw it open. But before I sort of pass it on to Paragji, I just wanted to say one thing as a way to formulate our thoughts here, which is that this we learn from the Jewish experience, okay? So there are 3 kinds of Hindus, in my opinion. So there's one kind of Hindu who's neither Hindu inside nor outside. So we're not going to worry too much about that, okay? Then there's another kind of Hindu who is both Hindu inside and outside. And we shouldn't worry that much about them too, because like most of you know what you're doing. Actually, the point is how to get your energies together. But a majority of Hindus, as far as I know, are those who may be Hindu inside, but they don't want to be Hindu outside. At least in the circles that I have found, in the university that I teach, for instance, and many other places. There is such a sense of cringing when somebody says, I'm a Hindu. They don't want to be identified as one. So one of our questions is, what do we do so that people are comfortable being Hindus outside as they are inside? Okay? So I want to come back to this idea of the 3 kinds of Hindus when we end. But now, without further ado, I'll request Parag Topiji to give us his ideas. You've given me the bad mic, I know.
Hello?
Next one.
So my topic is decapitalizing history in the context of Hindu identity. One way we define identity is what we know about ourselves from the past. So my interest in history, I'm a mechanical engineer, I was a management consultant, I dropped out of IIT. I own a software company, but I am passionate about history, and several years ago, can you go to the next slide? Several years ago, me, my brother, sister, brother-in-law, sister-in-law, my dad, we spent about 3 years. I took 2 years off from work. This was a time in which 2008 crash had happened and I was in the real estate industry, so I said, okay, this is a good time to take some time off. And we wrote a book on the War of 1857. I call it Anglo-Indian War of 1857. It was kind of a continuation of where Savarkar left off. Savarkar's book on 1857 was more about motivating people to fight against the British, but there were many elements which needed to be continued. So this was really more about continuing with that research. So we spent several years. We found letters written to Tatya Tope in Khateshikast. It's a script variation of Arabic. We worked with a professor in Jamia Millia. We got them translated. That's one chapter of the book. Over the process, I And after publishing the book, before publishing the book, after publishing the book, it was a eye-opener in terms of my own understanding of how deep our own history is. So my today's talk is about really presenting Indian history, or let's say presenting the differences between the way we look at history, how Hindus look at history, versus the way history is taught. And the reason I call it history, decapitalized history, is because just like, I'll get to that point shortly. Next slide. So let's take two examples in comparison of history. There's a place called as Hisar Lake in Turkey, where in the 1800s or so, there was a German businessman who was a self-proclaimed Homerian. He was obsessed with finding sites that Homer's Odyssey and Iliad had mentioned. So he was one of the things that he was looking for was Troy. So he used to fund many archaeological digs, and then in 1870 or so he found what he claimed to be Troy. So there was an archaeological finding, they excavated, and then there was a lot of debate among archaeologists, historians, and so on. And then finally, after much debate, they said, okay, even today I think that most people agree that what is in Hisar Lake, Turkey today is Troy. Now, contrast that to another excavation that took place in the 1990s in Farrukhabad, Uttar Pradesh. So there you have a team of Indian archaeologists and Italian archaeologists. They excavated this mound. It was nothing more than a mound, like a small hill. And there was some rain and some little old structure showed up, and then they excavated that structure. And they discovered Kampilya. So Kampilya, as you might know, was Drupad's kingdom. So now this was in the 1990s, but it did not make any news. I mean, some of you might have heard of it, but in general it did not make any news. Now, why did it not make any news? Was it not as important as Troy? I mean, roughly the same time frame, potentially Kampilya is much, much older. Is it that we don't care about our history? Well, the reason is simple. It wasn't news because it wasn't worthy of news, and the reason is very simple. The mound where they excavated and they found Kampilya was outside a village which is called as Kampil. People of Kampil used to call that hill Drupad Killa. Now this Killa ceased to be a Killa when it basically got covered with dust, and that probably happened 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. That means for 4,000 years, we knew that that place was Drupad's fort. This is the difference between Farrukhabad, Uttar Pradesh and Hisar Lake, Turkey. If you look at the 2,000 or 3,000 years since Troy, that place has been ruled by several civilizations, and every time the memory of the people has been erased. Every time a new set of cultures come, they erase the previous memories. You have something which is very, very unique in India. The continuity of the place, the people, and the stories that have been told across generations. India is the only place in the entire world where you see this unbroken continuity in the entire world. You won't see this in China, you won't see this in Southeast Asia, not Africa, not Europe, not anywhere in the world except India. So what I like to classify is that on one side you have this civilization which I call as the notion of looking at the past. Troy would be like a petrified civilization, something which has turned into rock, and then you look back, because it's dead, you treat that civilization as a dead civilization, and you study it in such a way. Now India is a living civilization, so when something is dead, you do an autopsy of it. That makes sense. But if something is living, will those methods work for you? They won't. So you have to fundamentally look at India in a very different way. So the Western model of history is rooted in its theological model. So the seminaries really turned into universities. Highly funded, very powerful seminaries have become into highly powerful, extremely well-funded universities which are tied with the government, and they are essentially creating history. Who creates the history? You have a set of certified intellectuals. The issue is not intellectuals, they are certified intellectuals who debate amongst themselves and they create content. So they will debate amongst themselves, they'll say, okay, this happened, this did not happen. they will challenge them so that eventually they will create what is called as a true discourse of what happened. They publish books, and then society in a highly hierarchical educational system will become passive consumers of that information. So the society is a passive consumers of that history, and I call that history, history with a capital H, just the way they capitalize the G in the God. History is history with a capital H. And I think in the morning there's a social media discussion, and I think one of the discussions would be like opinion with a capital O and opinion with a lowercase o. Same thing. Something which social media does would be something which the commoners do versus the elite do. This model of history is fundamentally unique to all Abrahamic civilizations. India again is very, very different. So the question is, if we cannot accept, the question is, should we accept? Should we accept that model? So, what was India's model for history? So it was decapitalized. There was no central universities. There wasn't a top-down funding. It wasn't a people who were certified intellectuals. So it was a very different model. It was nebulous. That means if you look to the past, you'll see some contradictions. You'll see, okay, maybe this happened, maybe this not happened. You'll see it's multi-threaded. You'll see slight variations of the same story here or there. Additional to that, one of the biggest things you see is there is a constraint of civility. You will not see name calling, you will not see analysis of history, you will not see lessons learned or doing. So if the purpose of history is to understand the mistakes that you made in the past, and if you look at what is traditionally known as history in India, you will not see name calling, you will not see finger pointing, you will not see an analysis of defeat, you will not see any of that. That means there are two possibilities. The one possibility is that either our ancestors were fools, that they decided that, okay, in the constraint of civility, we are not going to really pass on the lessons of history for posterity, or they had figured out another way. What I call it that if Western history is a monochromatic history, Hindu history is prismatic. So the same thread of history, the same set of events, if you go through the narrative, and I think narrative was a very important point that was made in the earlier media session, narratives are key. Hindu civilization has its own narrative. Now what we do is the same set of events, when they go through our narrative, our prism of civilization, we create 4 different threads. One thing is the story that you hear, is the story of Ramayana, Mahabharata, several threads. There is hagiography, there is a praise, there is unquestionable praise, right? There is hagiography. Many Westerners will just reject that. Oh, how can you call that history? There is that. There is abstracted philosophy. You get plenty examples of philosophy on top of these stories. So where are the lessons captured? The lessons are captured in a very, very unique way, and it's a very incredibly clever way. The way they are captured is, for example, if there was a king who, on the advice of somebody wrong and based on rhetoric, made an alliance which was questionable, and that led to his defeat, do we need to call him by name? Why can't we make him into a foolish duck and take that story, take that lesson, and put that into a set of stories which you teach children every day, day after day? Those are the stories which are part of the Panchatantra. Those are the stories that are part of the Hitopadesha, and some lessons are captured as Subhashitas. So the lessons learned were not necessarily pointing fingers. You don't have to take Prithviraj Chauhan's name and say that, look how foolish he was. That does not make any sense. That does not fit into the constraint of our civilization. The lesson is more important than name calling, right? So this is what we did. And given this context, what is it that can we do to decapitalize history? And we'll get to that in a minute.
Little segue which I can't resist. In a sense, we could have also called this decapitating history. Because this history that you're talking about, the itihas, the cultural memory, has actually been decapitated. And instead of Kambil, the place is called Farrukhabad, and instead of Nalanda, it's called Bakhtiyarpur. So I think this is another thing that we have to, you can't hear at the back. Is that better? No. Shall I try that? Which one? This one? Okay, is this better? Okay, thank you. So I said that this section could easily have been called decapitating history or decapitated history. But the only thing I want to say before I move on is that the question of history became central to modern India, starting with Bankim or even earlier, because they found that you can't be a people, you can't be a nation if you don't have a history, in the modern sense of the word, history with a capital H. And in a sense, in the teleology of the West, God became replaced with history with a capital H. For instance, in the Marxist theology, I call it another form of theology, where there is salvation at the end of revolution. We can go into it later. But here's the thing, which I started off. In many ways, Hindus, were wanting to be people who could transcend time, We wanted to be Akalis. We did not want to realize ourselves through time. That is why, in a sense, we are called the Sanatana. And I wanted to, yesterday I told Avtans Ji, who is the organizer, one of the organizers along with Sushil Ji of this fantastic media track, that I'm going to offer a new etymology of Sanatana, which I might do later, and he's a linguist, so he can correct me. So I think the real thing is, can we have both history in the modern Western sense and also itihasa? And now, in fact, this is what we have a third, angle in this triangle, which is what people like my friend Amish are doing, that they're neither writing history nor itihasa, or maybe a modern kind of itihasa, but they're reconfiguring our sense of the self through a new narrative, which we'll come to later. But now, I hand it over to Kiran.
So Makarandi asked me to step in for presenting early this morning. And basic thought was integrating Indian ethos in the global economy. And it so happened that last 2 months back, we're in the process of setting up a center for soft power in Chennai. And this is a subject which is very close to my heart. So I readily jumped in. And thank you for giving me this opportunity. Yeah, next. So Stanford recently made a tweet saying that breathing is good for yoga, or breathing is good for people, or something like that. So they just discovered the importance of pranayama. And nose breathing is good. Nose breathing is good. So they just discovered that. So basically, if you look at the left side of the slide, I want to make four key messages in my order time. Whether it's karma yoga or environment, Ayurveda, festivals, handicrafts, arts, asana, meditation, spirituality, or mantra. James Hadsell recently came up with the Sanskrit effect of improved memory because of chanting. Any of these things, already everybody is establishing, everybody is consuming it. There's no need for us to push for integration. But one thing that's crucial and that's missing is acknowledgement of where the sources are coming from, and second is devotion. So I'm now waiting for Harvard or Stanford to come up with saying that bhakti is important. And with bhakti, that 20% benefits are also going to manifest. Millennials. What are the global trends in the millennials that we want the Indian ethos to integrate with? Very big thing that recently Financial Times was talking about. Millennials are really looking for authentic experiences. They're no longer looking at superficial experiences, they want authenticity. It's a very, very important thing. We need to understand that trend. Craft. So it's no longer a regular Heineken beer or whatever you need craft beer. Everything is craft. Sustainability, environment, spirituality, of course, everybody knows, wellness is known. But more other important thing is people want cultural experiences and ceremony. This is a very big trend amongst millennials that we need to understand from, again, integrating the Indian ethos into the global economy. Now, most of you are already aware of what's going to happen.
Next, please.
In terms of artificial intelligence, next slide please. Artificial intelligence and the loss of jobs in the next 5 to 10 years. What I anticipate as a consequence of this is the Indian ethos, the Indian structure of Purushartha, whereas Dharma, Artha, Kama and Moksha. And if you have a universal basic income and you're getting your monthly check or a monthly dole, then, is it hastening up the process of pursuit of moksha? This is something, a trend that we need to look at, and how do we look at producing gurus? I come from the lineage of Swami Dayananda Saraswati and Swami Chemayananda, who have actually conceptualized this whole thing of Upanishads, Gita, Sanskrit, Prasthanatraya, the whole thing, Prakarana Das, the whole thing into producing gurus. Maybe, if you look at the globe, what is the requirement, how many spiritual gurus does this globe want? And how many executive coaches or life coaches does the globe need? So, if you watch this TV serial called Silicon Valley, there's a thing called 3 comma thinking. So basically, if you're a billionaire, you have to have 3 commas in your billion. And so we need to think that perhaps in our lifetimes, we can make 1 billion people realize their Indic DNA, that they're already consuming the Indic knowledge, Indic traditions. And how do we do that? If you look at on the right side, authenticity, non-dualism, yoga, meditation, mindfulness, stoicism, Ayurveda, craft, curated cultural experience, sustainable living, environment, these are already part of Sanatana Dharma. They're all part of us, right? But what we need to do is that link has been broken. That's what has happened. That's what the distortion that Rajiv and everybody talks about, is that distortion of our identity that has happened. And the link between all these things that the globe is already consuming and all this which is the essence of Sanatana Dharma, that link has to be established. And how do we do that? What kind of technology do we use? We have to think exponential, we have to think non-linear, we have to think disruptive, we have to think design thinking. These are the thoughts that we have to use artificial intelligence. These are the things that we have to think if we want to re-establish that link between what the globe is already consuming and what is already our essence. What we are doing in this center is we are trying to create a dashboard, looking at setting up a fund to look at cultural startups, looking at refinancing as an option. Why can't Mudra Bank refinance an American here who wants to set up a yoga studio? You tie up with Citibank and he goes to Citibank and gets the financing for his yoga studio, and then refinance from Mudra Bank. So we can look at that kind of a structure, looking at a network of Indian cultural entrepreneurs globally. Why can't we have a NASCOM-like structure where all the global cultural entrepreneurs are part of it, and then we can come up with policy advocacy. So these are some of the thoughts in terms of how we can integrate ourselves, integrate Indian ethos into the global economy. Thank you.
So, Kiranji, I'm get back to this. Can you hear me now at the back? Okay, great. I just wanted to say that you may not know of Kiranji's work, but he has spawned a whole network of networks under the umbrella of Indic and Indica. So I urge you to look at it. It has the Indic Academy, it has a film component called Indica, it has an Indic book club, and it has various other Indic platforms in which people come together. And you'll also notice that he never used the word Hindu, and he also never used the word marketing. But both these are crucial, which is that when we speak of the Hindu identity in an era of multiculturalism and globalization, a big question is, how do we present ourselves? How do we market ourselves even to the next generation so that our own children don't feel oh, it's so not cool, you know. I don't want, I can have a Buddha tankha in my room or in my office, but I can't have an idol, you know, that's so uncool. So I think that here is where you've got a lot of ideas of how to present yourself and ourselves to the world. And it seems to me that there's so much always already Hindu all over the world, which is so popular, that we just have to be able to sort of point it out by saying, you know what, this is the source. And isn't it wonderful that breathing systematically is going to increase your oxygen supply or make you feel better or whatever. But on that note, let me now invite Amish, who is a publishing phenomenon. You know, he has sold more books than any living Indian author, in fact, as far as I know. And what is amazing about him is that he is one of the most modest people I know. This is such a rare and a Hindu combination. And there's one more amazing thing about Amish, which is he is deeply and passionately committed to learning. He's always trying to learn things, you know. So we want to learn from you today, Amish. Go ahead.
Oh my, okay. I'm at a loss for words, which is not good for an author. Thank you. Thank you so much for a very kind introduction. Before we begin, if I can have a show of hands, how many of you know the entire story of the Ramayana? Let me calibrate that question a bit. It does not mean watching the 1980s television serial. It means there are various versions of the Ramayana. There's the original Valmiki Ramayana, there's the Ramcharitmanas, which was the modernization of Tulsidas Ji in the 16th century. There's the Kamban Ramayanam, there's the Adbhut Ramayana. How many of you have read one entire Ramayana? Okay, it's a very good number, but still I would say maybe 50%. Okay. Now let's have a show of hands for the Mahabharata. Again, not the 1980s television serial. It could be the critical edition, it could be any edition. How many of you have read the entire Mahabharata, start to finish? Again, around 50%? Okay. You know, and this is fantastic, because of the conference that we are in, I'm not surprised that it's 50%. If I'd asked anywhere else, it would probably be 3, 4, 5%. Okay. If I'd asked this question 300 years ago, you know, Gurukul, guess what the answer would have been?
100%.
100%. There is a lie that has been fed to us that we had no education system, that we were a bunch of monkeys hanging from trees, and the British came and gave us an education system, which is actually not true. How many of you have heard of Dharampal Ji? Again, thank God, good number. I get so disappointed at so many conferences that people haven't heard of him. If you haven't, do check out his books. They're available free on the net, especially the book The Beautiful Tree. Okay? He speaks of what the Indian education system was like before the British came and destroyed it. Now there is a class of Indians which doesn't believe any data until it has the stamp of the British. Okay? So Dharampal Ji actually wrote this book based on records that the British officers had themselves kept of what our education system was like. Now, there are various standard texts, okay, like the standard text for mathematics, for example, was Leelavati by Bhaskaracharya Ji. But Ramayana and the Mahabharata, okay, were there as standard texts everywhere, okay, and it was not just religious. That wasn't the purpose of it. That wasn't the core purpose of it. And that's what I want to explore with you guys today. Okay? If you see the story of the Mahabharata, the axis of that story is, and it spreads out a lot, but the axis of the story is more from the west to the east of India. And I'm talking about the Indian subcontinent, not modern India. Yeah? The axis of the story is largely in that region. And if you see the axis of the Ramayana is largely north-south. Okay? There were actually roads which ran that way. There's the Uttar Path and the Dakshin Path, which actually ran that way. If you notice, the core story of the Mahabharata is essentially in that Punjab, Haryana area. Okay? And the core story of the Ramayana is essentially the Kosala, Ayodhya area and Lanka. But you notice in both those texts, almost every part of the Indian subcontinent is somehow woven into it. Do you notice that? Almost every part is somehow woven in. So there will be some flashback, some small story, something. So that's the first thought I want to leave with you. Why did they do that? Because one of the ways of looking at culture is shared stories. All of us believe in a shared story, it means we have one culture. If this was the foundational text, they wanted everyone in the Indian subcontinent to be attached to it. That was one of the thoughts behind it. It's one of the, and I can't say I have come up with these theories, actually this was, many of these insights were given to me by my grandfather. He was a Pandit in Kashi, in Banaras. And he said this was the perspective with which these stories were created. It's one of the things I keep in the back of my mind. When I'm writing my books, I'll always try and bring in some part of wherever the story is happening. Okay, so for example, in Sita Warrior of Mithila, the mother of Sita Ma, I've shown her to be the daughter of the queen of Mizoram and the king of Assam, Kamruk. Okay, just essentially every part of the Indian subcontinent should be woven in. That was one perspective on the story. The second perspective on the story was that actually you learn philosophies on various aspects through the concept of a nice, kick-ass, fun-loving story. Okay? Because if you're having a pure, boring satsang philosophy session, most, especially the youth, they switch off. Correct? But if you're listening to a nice, page-turning, fun story, but through that, without realizing it, some philosophies have gone in the back of your head, that's good for you. Right? So actually, if you see it from this perspective, the Shanti Parva in the Mahabharata is actually a governance lesson. It's a governance lesson from the perspective of a nice story. So you don't get awed, you don't get like ye kya ho raha, calm down types, right? So and this was one of the perspectives again in the Ramayana and Mahabharata. Again, I'm saying these are just the entry level scriptures into our entire library of scriptures. Ramayana and Mahabharata are like the first standard actually. We have to go deeper and deeper, and the Vedas are at the graduation level, the Upanishads are the post-graduation level. So that's the second perspective. Learn philosophies, learn the art of living, okay, through these stories. It's again another thing I try to keep in mind in my books. I always try and bring in philosophies in the books. The third thing, if you've noticed, okay, again let's have a pop quiz. How many people say that the Lakshman Rekha is not mentioned in the Ramayana? Show of hands, raise your hands. That's it? Okay, I expected a better quality here. Okay.
You know how I know only because you told me last time.
Okay, the thing is, the Lakshman Rekha is there in our Indian constitutions today because of the 1980s television serial where Lord Lakshman took out that arrow and drew the line in the mud. But the 80s television serial was largely based on the Ramcharitmanas, which was written by Tulsidas ji in the 16th century, in which the Lakshman Rekha is mentioned, but again not in the way that Raman and Sagar showed it. Okay? But in the original Valmiki Ramayana, there is no Lakshman Rekha. Okay? Now this is just one small example of this. There are many examples. Okay? But if you think, the point of it is not the difference. The point is that what did Tulsidas ji do? He took the original Valmiki Ramayana and he kept the soul, but he adapted it to the idiom of the 16th century. Right? Why? So that it appeals to the youth of that time. Ultimately, our culture will remain alive only when the youth carry it forward. Okay? Only when the youth feel it in their bones, in their mind. And our ancestors have done it very well. They've done it repeatedly. We are the only culture, ancient culture, which is still alive till today. We refuse to die because our youth have carried our flag forward always. Now I know there's this perspective among many parents. I hear it a lot. That our children, they're not interested in our culture at all. All they're interested in is Beyonce. She's some singer, right? They're interested in Beyonce and God knows who else. Okay. And there's this Sanskrit play by Kalidasa ji called Malavika Agni Mitram. You would have read it, I'm sure. Not one of his finest plays, but even in that there is a scene where a father is complaining about his son. Saying this exact same thing. Look at my son. Okay. Even 1500 years ago parents were complaining, even today parents are complaining, but our culture is still around, right? the thing to realize is that the responsibility is on us. We have to make sure that our stories are relevant to the youth. And we have to make sure that the soul remains pure, the soul remains as strong as it was, but we change the outer covering. We adjust it a bit, as Tulsidas did in the 16th century. And that's what we have to do now. And every generation has its own key filter. Like the filter for our generation, was rebelliousness. There was a reason why, when many of us were young, why Marxism and all of it was so popular, because it tied into the rebellious zeitgeist of our generation. The zeitgeist of this present generation, the filter that they look at is cool, that it has to be cool. If it's not cool, they don't take the second step, right? And that is something that we have to learn. If we want to, make our philosophies, our stories popular with the youth, we have to get this first filter through. Unless they find it cool, they will not take the next step. So it's our job to figure out how to make it happen. And then, trust me, our youth have been doing it for 10,000 years. They will do it for this one more generation again. That's a thought I wanted to give.
Thank you, Arushi, for that very positive, optimistic, and extremely confident assertion, which I tend to agree with, because even when we are surrounded by, so to speak, breaking India, Bharat, Dodo forces, you've shown us how stories can knit us together, that stories have the capacity to, to sort of do the Jodo, or rather, making India narrative. And the beauty of the story is that, and this is, it brings us back to history, time, that we have always tried to deny in the sense of transcend time and find some kind of eternity or immortality. And yet, and that's why we call, the word Akshara. And yet, it's interesting how no story is possible without time, because all stories are about movement in time, it's chronological time. And therefore, what I'm trying to sort of, maybe it's a slightly complicated idea, but what's happening is the renewal of the narrative is, as it were, the renewal of that originary moment. So when you read Tulsi, there is actually a hint in the earlier stanzas, the prelude, that it's like Tulsi is a kind of Valmiki reincarnate, So, in other words, from time to time, yada yada dharmasya type of thing, but it's also in terms of our narrative renewal. And I'm sure, I'm positive, in fact, that Amish is a reincarnation. Let me finish. I'm not saying necessarily of Valmiki or Kalidas, but he is a reincarnation or a re-instantiation or a re-expression of an authentic inspiration which is deeply Indic and which is going to take us forward, because he's going to make being Indian, being Hindu, cool for another generation. So now I come to the most militant of us Hindus. Monsieur François Gauthier. He was a correspondent of one of the, largest selling French newspapers for a very long time. And the last time I was in a panel with him, it was in Guwahati, and it became so controversial that one of the panelists said, who had links with lots of, militant groups in Assam, and he called him out and he said, don't talk rubbish, and I had to keep them calm. And he said, I can just phone up a few of my friends and they'll break your bones or something. And I just found that after the session was over, after tea, François had a black cat commando going around with him everywhere. So anyhow, he's fearless, but I want to tell you something, that the little I know of him, he's not only a gentleman, but he's a very gentle soul. Actually, he's very soft inside, okay? And he's just written this beautiful book on Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, which I recommend to you. It will be out in the market soon. But here's a little small book which I think is more relevant to our panel about Hindu identity, which is called India's Self-Denial. So I actually want to say this, that the greatest adversary of Hindus, I mean, we talk about the Abrahamics and other people, but actually we are our greatest adversaries, because the enemy has been planted in our own mind and we are so ashamed of who we are. So actually we are in a state of civil war in India, and that is why we have to, should I say, conclusively, as it were, defeat this other naysaying side which wants to deny us our civilization, demonize our past, deny our classical heritage. And in this kind of battle and struggle, friends like Francois Gautier, who are fearless, he's done a Hindu genocide museum, there were slides that he's created. No one wants to give him the space, to show these slides. But these are the bitter truths of our, so to speak, suppressed or decapitated history, which must come up, but not with the view of revenge histories or counter-narratives. But for any truth and reconciliation, we should first know what happened to us. Over to you.
Difficult to speak after Amish Tripathi and Macron. It's wonderful to be Hindu. When I came here as 19 years old. Actually, I drove from Paris to Pondicherry because I wanted to see the world, and I felt that seeing the world would make a man out of me. And it happened that someone told me, oh, there's a caravan of cars driving from Paris to Pondicherry. And so I drove. I knew nothing about India, nothing about spirituality, nothing about Hindus. And so I drove from Paris to Delhi. And the first night in Delhi, I spent in the Sri Aurobindo ashram. Those of you who know Delhi, India now it's become a very big school. And those days there was an old house. It was a beautiful place in the fields. And I opened a book of Sri Aurobindo, and I read a few lines, and I felt that I would spend the rest of my life in this country and defend this country. And there was a great knowledge in this country. All this was intuition. I was very young and didn't come in my mind as a thought. It came in my mind as an intuition that there's a great knowledge in this country and I will stay there for the rest of my life. Then I spent many years in the Sri Aurobindo ashram of Pondicherry. The mother was alive, and there were only Hindus there. And I was a Frenchman, quite young still, and I saw these Hindus, and they had such plasticity of mind, of the body, such gentleness, friendship, smile, that I felt, oh, why was I born a Frenchman? Why?
So you married a Hindu.
Why couldn't I have been born a Hindu? Then I had done a little bit of, freelancing, journalism and photography before leaving Paris. And the guru died. The mother, who was Sri Aurobindo's companion, she was a French woman. She died, and when the guru dies, you are an orphan. You don't know what to do with your life. So after some time, I started freelancing, and I discovered the Hindus. My first feature was in Kerala, on an ashram mat called Karari Payat. I had seen a BBC documentary that Karari Payat, was taken by Buddhist monks first to China, where it became the Shaolin boxing, known as Kung Fu also, and then to Japan, where it merged with some local martial arts and became karate and many other martial arts. So I went to Kerala to meet these masters. It's a countryside art, and they were Hindus and simple people, who doing seva in the evening. They would have a job in the evening. They would teach children from the villages this wonderful art of Karari Payat, which is a great, great martial art. I didn't talk about it here. And I discovered the Hindu. I was still very young with my camera. I was ignorant about India, and they accepted me. And I thought that there was that knowledge which I had felt the first time as an intuition. I saw it in these people, but it is not in the mind. Hindus don't say like Christians, oh, I have to be good, I have to do charity, I have to accept other people. It is in their genes, and these were simple people, they were not intellectual. And I saw that this knowledge had been passed from generation to generation of Hindus, you know, and transmitted, and it was there. I could see it in his masters. Then I became a political journalist because all life is politics, you know. You put 10 people together and politics starts, you know. In the Hindu groups in the US, there's a lot of politics also. So I wanted to be a political journalist because this is life, you know. Shri said, you know, all life is yoga, so politics is also yoga. So I became a journalist. And one of my first assignments was in Kashmir. Maybe I started in covering Kashmir in the late 80s, when it was still a little quiet. The militancy had started, but it was not as bad as it had become today. And I saw the Hindus of Kashmir, you know, being persecuted, killed, raped, you know, strangled with wire, and then, you know, in a few days, 400,000 of them fled without firing a single shot in defense. You know, I'm a Frenchman, you know, and I love Hindus, but I wish the Kashmiri Hindus had, you know, fought. Even if they had died, I wish they would have fought, because they just fled, you know, in a few days like this, and became refugees in their own country. And it broke my heart, actually. It broke my heart. Once I was with a, you know, Italian correspondent, and we went to see a small temple. They were the last Hindu temple in Srinagar. In those days, Srinagar was always under curfew, so you needed permits to go. And there was one Hindu temple which had been attacked, you know, by militants 2 days before. So I dragged my Italian friend who was not interested, and I met these bandits, you know, who were protected by the BSF and, you know, and the army. And again, I felt so touched by these people, the Hindus, who had suffered so much, and yet kept their faith. Because the greatest Holocaust in the history of the world is that of the Hindus. I mean, there are numbers which are, you know, terrifying. People say 100 million Hindus have died from the Hindu Kush till Bombay, you know, till the Bombay attacks and the Taj Mahal. And yet, they kept their smile, they kept their face, they kept their knowledge. You know, the last living knowledge in the world is that of the Hindus. We talk about Hindu identity, but it's an easy identity. You know, you are the inheritors of the last great knowledge of this world, which me as a Frenchman, I was looking for unconsciously, and when I came to India, I found it. Who am I? What happens when I die? What is an avatar? What is karma? What is dharma? Different, you know, plans of consciousness, you know, guruship and discipleship, you know, such wonderful knowledge. You know, that the whole world is looking for that knowledge. So Hindus should be carrying that knowledge with them, you know, because they have it in their genes, you know. But I find today that the Hindus, you're an exception, of course, all of you, but you're a tiny minority. You are a bloody tiny minority. You know, there are 1 billion Hindus in this world. How many of them carry that knowledge? You know, that I am a Hindu, you know, okay, I can tolerate you, but I'm also, you know, I am also inheritor of the Bhagavad Gita, which says, when your people are threatened, you know, when your culture is threatened, when your women are threatened, you need to fight. You need to rise up, and if necessary, with force. So, Hindu identity survived so many centuries. As I said, 100 million Hindus died, you know. If you see the story of the Hindu Kush, 1 million Hindus died on the Hindu Kush, frozen to death. So, they survived the Muslim invasions, they even survived colonization. But the greatest tragedy of the Hindus is Mr. Nehru. Because Mr. Nehru just took up the British system, you know, the British legal system, the British education system, the British democratic system, and just clamped it on India, you know, without caring to adapt it to the Indian psyche, which is very different from the Western psyche. And Mr. Nehru created generation after generation, not only, you know, historians who were distorted Indian history, not only of intellectuals, you know, who ran down Hindus, but also of ordinary Hindus who forgot that they're Hindus. You know, I go and I see in the US universities, you know, the percentage of Indian students, Hindu students, you know, who have a knowledge about who they are, where they're coming from. You know, there's great knowledge, it's great. ancestry, these great poets, these great warriors, the Kalidasa, the Shivaji Maharaj, Rani Jhansi. It's a tiny minority again. So, I'm scared, and then I come here and I see people like Amit and Makaran, and I say, there is a hope, because Hindus today are under attack everywhere, from all sides. And they're not aware of that. Hindus think that Hinduism is eternal, but I don't think so. I think that Hindu identity needs to be preserved, needs to be fought for. It needs to be fought for. When I see the articles written in the US media, the New York Times have been particularly venomous against Mr. Modi and the BJP, the government, and the BBC and CNN, you have to stand up. I'm a French guy and I stand up for you because I think that you're wonderful people and this knowledge. This knowledge dies, if this Hindu identity dies, the world will die. This is the last knowledge. If this Hindu identity dies, the world has nothing left because the world has forgotten itself. We see everywhere. It's not only Islam, that thinks that there is only one religion. It's also Christianity still. It's also so many other people. The entire West doesn't know anymore. People are depressed. People commit suicide. People take so much, medicines to sleep, to live. So you are the last knowledge. I'm not here to praise you, but I'm saying that you have to be conscious that not only it's a privilege to be born a Hindu, to have this Hindu identity, but it's also a duty. That you have a duty to stand for your brothers and sisters, and you have a duty to protect that knowledge because it's under attack from every side. I see in India, I lived nearly 50 years in India, and today under the BJP government and the Hindu government, it's attacked from all sides. Kashmir has degenerated, worse than it was under the Congress. Today the Kashmiri Muslims are more radicalized than ever. The conversions of Christianity goes on at a very, very, very rapid pace, which is frightening for me. A born Catholic, my father was a staunch Catholic, my uncle whom I loved so much was a Catholic priest, But I see the conversions, with financial gains and incentives, that's going on. Or in Kerala now with the flood, but it happened with the tsunami, it's happening everywhere. The Marxist media is still, powerful. Right? So what I'm saying is, one, it's wonderful to be Hindu. Second, it's a privilege. And third, it's a duty. You need to stand up. And you, the Hindus of America, you have this duty more than anybody because you've done well and, you came from you've been educated in India, so you need to give back to India. You need to give back to the Hindu identity by standing up for it. Say one word, when I started writing, when I started discovering who were the Hindus, I started writing books, there were very, very few people then in those days. There was one gentleman called Sitaram Goel, and then my other inspiration was another gentleman from Belgium, from Conrad Els, who was here today.
If I may say this to everyone, if you haven't read the works of Conrad Els, shame on you guys. Go check it out. They're brilliant.
Thank you so much, François, because you've actually sort of summed up the gist of this panel, which is when you ask what does it mean to be a Hindu, or what is the Hindu identity in an era of multiculturalism and globalization. What you're telling us is that being a Hindu means having a certain knowledge. Being a Hindu is about consciousness. And lastly, and certainly not in the least, being a Hindu is also a responsibility. So what I'm going to do now is that we are supposed to end at 5:30, but Sushil-ji, we started late, and so how long can we go on? Sushilji, how long can we go on? Yes?
Midnight!
How long do you want us to go on? Because we were supposed to, we were supposed to end at 5:30. Shall we end at 5:45? 5:45? Okay, hang on. Let's see. Because we don't want to cut into the next one, which is at 6. At 6. So we must end, I would say, let's try and end at about latest 5:50. Okay, latest. I know, that's what I said. 5:50 latest. Okay, now what we'll do is we'll have a quick round of questions and then all the panelists will get theirs, including a couple of minutes. But my humble request, please do not give talks. We love you, we want to hear your opinions, but please only ask questions, alright? And we'll take 3 or 4 questions at a time and I will point to people. Yes sir, I hear you, I see you in the blue jacket, yeah. And please introduce yourself and ask a question. Do not make a speech.
My name is Ashish, I'm coming from Canada. One thing I've noticed in the media in general is, for example, movies like Mission Impossible, as well as digital media like Google Maps and everything. The narrative that's being told is not what I'm hearing from the panel or from the community, as per Kashmir Map and all. How do we change that narrative, as in the one that's being enforced?
Okay, got it. How do you change the narrative from the one that's being imposed? That's one question. Yes, sir. Go ahead. We'll take about 3 or 4, those will forget the questions.
So my question is regarding what Makarand had probably touched on, that most of the problems that we face are self-created in a sense, and it's not coming from the outside. And we see that a lot of people among who all of us agree, but still there is not a platform to disagree without outsiders exploiting our disagreements. So how do we have a platform where we continue to disagree with each other, but we also have an ecosystem which is as strong as the left, so that they're really
great
radical.
question.
So how
Terrific
do we
question.
counter that?
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Dr. Vijayalakshmi from Bengaluru, Professor of Pediatric Cardiology. Talking about the Hinduism and it is in our gene, I agree. But at present in India, we have the enemies within us, especially the leftist and the neoliberal leftists. They are pumping poison into the blood of the youngsters, and they are narrating all Manusmriti and all concocted stories to distort the whole Hinduism, and they are creating the enemies within India to destroy the Hinduism. So I want to know how to tackle that.
Okay, terrific. And one last question for this first round. चेयरमैन को आपका हाथ देखना पड़ेगा, तो मैं आपके पास आ रहा हूँ, लेकिन पहले आप सर, पहले आप.
Makarand ji, address to the panel. My question is, we are talking about preserving Hindu identity. My question is about globalization.
Yes.
And my kids are grown here, and I understand India is a sacred geography, but to my kids, I mean, shouldn't be globalization in Hinduism which says Colorado Mata or Ohio River Mata, or if my kid is growing in Australia, instead of cow being sacred, shouldn't kangaroo be sacred?
Okay, very good point. Can we use Hindu categories to globalize? Very good. So now I request my panelists to pick up the question they want. Don't answer all the questions. I'll ask Amish first. Which question do you want to address? The one about
On the narrative, look, there are a few things. One thing that we have to realize: this is not a battle that will be won in 6 months. This is a generation or two fight, long battle. So we have to have. It's one of the things that that sometimes our community lacks, which is focus and discipline. So we need focus and discipline. And there are two areas in this. One is education. It's very easy to blame politicians, but I think politics is one of the toughest jobs in our country. We're a very complex country, so we have to put pressure up that we want the education system to be Indianized. The education system is still completely colonial, and we have to stop blaming the British. They've been gone for 70 years. Even our maths teachers know, it doesn't teach Bhaskaracharya, it doesn't teach Bodhayana. Our medicine does not teach Charak or Shushrut. It teaches, Hippocrates. Even the number of seasons is my favorite example. The number of seasons that we are taught in Indian schools is that we have 4 seasons, which is wrong. Europe has 4 seasons, India has 6 seasons. So even something as basic as this is completely colonial. So that's the first thing. We have to put pressure on our politicians, Indianize our education system. The other thing is popular culture. How do we make our popular culture more Indian? That's a responsibility on all of us. What we ourselves buy and support, and what popular culture artists can do. Vivek is walking out when I talk about popular culture, sadly, but he is one of the guys who can work on this. Madhur Bhandarkar is here somewhere. My friend Madhur, he has to work on this. I have to work on it. All of us in the popular culture need to bring in our own narrative, our own culture into it, and this will take time. It's not going to turn in a switch, but all of us have to keep working at it.
Thank you, Ameshji. Praladji said that he will tackle the kangaroo question.
So the question of kangaroo being respected, or any animal or any river, I think that's universal. There's nothing in Hindu teaching which localizes. The lessons of India can be applied anywhere, really. Now, specifically about kangaroo versus cow, the answer is very simple. The reason in Hinduism we respect every animal. The only animal who we depend on for milk, we drink her milk. So we drink her milk, therefore she's a mata. If somebody is drinking kangaroo milk, absolutely they should treat kangaroo like a mata. But I would say go mata. If you're a vegan, then you don't need to treat it. In fact, you're even kinder. You're saying that why even torture her, especially in the West, the way milk is extracted. It's a very torturous process. So many of our kids are actually becoming vegan because they see that it's torturesome. But I would say your question is great, but I think the answers are already universal. I think whatever we learn, whatever we teach our children is already universal.
Fantastic. I will invite Kiranji to answer the question about how you can create a platform where you can disagree without other people exploiting these disagreements. Because he's trying to create many platforms.
So there are several networks here when we're building an ecosystem. What Indian Academy is trying to do is to be an infrastructure, like an ecosystem is like a cultural biosphere, and then you have the living organisms, which are all the public intellectuals and the academics, and then you have the non-living organisms, which are the networks and the infrastructure. So what Indian Academy is trying to do, infrastructure part. So generally, I don't have any view, so if I have a view, then everything else that Indian Academy does will be conflated with that, so I tend to remain neutral in that. There is within our there's a lot of disagreements happening, and I think it's very healthy, even though oftentimes we are affected by that. We should not look for unanimity. We should look for unity. Unity of purpose, and not unanimity of strategy. So there are diverse people. There are a lot of people who are working with me and left and starting something new. It's good. We, like I was telling Makranji yesterday, we have been bled with 1,000 cuts. Right? So every cut has to be healed, and a flower, a social entrepreneur should bloom from that cut. So therefore,
Can I just add one thing? I don't know how many of you know Hari Kiran. He's doing a lot of quite hard work in building the ecosystem. A round of applause for him, please.
One more question about the poison being injected in the youth, and I'm leaving our Surgeon General. He might even suggest amputation. But I just wanted to add, Kiranji did mention one thing, which is, how to deal with the ego, because we see even in our ecosystem, there's some people who are becoming almost megalomaniacs. They don't care about the cause. It's a kind of narcissism which is so heady that it's only about them. They're just projecting themselves. And in a way, you have to do it. You have to project yourself. You have to market yourself. But at what time, what point do you tip over? So these are things that are very important for all of us. And for me, the thing is sadhana, that whatever you do is a form of self-realization. And it's for your own psychic and spiritual development. And in fact, when you have detractors, when people oppose you, that's good for you, because at some level, as Ramana Maharishi said, the enemy of your ego is your friend, because your enemy's enemy is a friend. So,
Mr. Pranjal, may I take this opportunity? I wanted to point out to what Mr. François said about Kashmir. I thought I need to correct a certain...
Later. Let him have his say. I mean, let's not get into... He said people should have defended. Let it be for the moment. Let it be. Let's get many voices.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's have more questions.
Yeah.
I'll
give you a minute to
I would
respond
love that.
later. Because we are all Kashmiris here. We are all Kashmiri Pandits here. Don't worry. We are all for you. So don't have to
just not really to defend, just to share facts, just to share some information.
Give you a little
Let's take more questions,
Okay, about the poison that's fed into kids, there are two aspects. I'm born a Frenchman, I'm educated a Frenchman, I'm proud to be a Frenchman. Because in school I'm taught about my poets and my heroes and my warriors and so I'm born to be, but in India you bring up your kids without knowing about their own history, their own heroes, their own heroines. So you already have bred, someone who's lost his Hinduness. The second thing is, it is true that the media is very hostile and goes after Hindus. But again, we'll come back to Kashmir. Why don't Hindus stand up? There are 1 billion Hindus in this world. One in 7 person is a Hindu, and all people educated, doing well, wealthy, law-abiding people who don't go about rioting and burning cars, who respect the others, Why don't Hindus stand up for their own people, and stand up, I mean, necessary with a gun. It's necessary with a gun. If the Chinese attack India again, and this is quite a possibility, that there's a war between China and India, because the Chinese are very intelligent. They understand that India is the biggest enemy, economically, politically, militarily, nuclearly, in any way. So they understand that. If there's again a war between India and China, India needs to win that war. Yeah, again,
I think that's a good answer. We'll give Sushilji a moment, just a moment to respond, please. Just a moment. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Just a moment.
Mr. Guthier, I wish we had a chance to fight. Really. In fact, I don't know whether I should. I don't know for how long or how long before you were there.
Many years.
Wonderful. So then you must have known Kashmiri Hindu population in the total population was less than 5%. Less than 5%. 2, they did not live in clusters or ghettos. They were completely spread all over, even lived in the minority of one house surrounded by 100 or 50. 3, they were not armed. 4, they were abandoned by their own state.
Yes.
When I say state, not the state government. They were abandoned by their own nation state.
Yes.
Number 5, they were up against another state, enemy state on the border that had funded an insurgency. Lethal, armed, committed, bigoted insurgency, which was out to kill. The first iconic killing that took place was on 14th of September. The man was Tikalal Taplu. The exodus happened in January. You must know, when the exodus happened, I'll just finish. When the exodus happened, state was ruled by National Conference and Congress combined. The center was ruled by Vishwanath Pratap Singh, supported by BJP and left. The entire political spectrum was in the power structure, not one was outside the power structure. So the entire political class was complicit in our exodus. Not one stood up. Not one party, not one leader stood up. We were unarmed, non-combatants with the responsibility of children, women and old parents. We either had to get slaughtered or just save our lives to come out and fight another day.
Okay, thank you so much. But we don't want this panel to get derailed, okay, into a kind of slangy match over this particular issue. We respect different views. In fact, we are going to do a second round. Anshuji, please sit down. I request you. Yeah. Now, well, just a moment, please. Sushiji, please sit down. Let me conduct this. Yeah, please hand over the mic. My point is something different. My point is, just a second, sir. I haven't noticed you. Please sit down. Not you. I'm talking about that gentleman. Haji, pehle aap. Yes. No. Yeah. Yes. You. Yes. Go ahead. Please introduce yourself briefly.
My name is Girish Sharma. I come from Orlando, Florida. And my question is, how do we make Hinduism cool again? With so little investment, both in terms of time, energy and money, in terms of media. Like the books, like the publication and other digital media, how do we make Hinduism cool again?
Thank you. You will get your chance. Be patient, sir. Other people are raised that.
You need to be patient, sir.
Well, either you...
I'm asking you for the last 10 minutes to speak and you are having me.
So many people. No, either...
At least 7 times.
I have to notice you, sir. And... No. Either you chair the session or I chair it. Please.
So, you mentioned about the Lakshman Rekha, and the Ramayana from Valmiki's time changed over by Tulsidas ji for that generation. So, I'm talking about Devdutt Patnaik over here on his show at Devlok on Epic Channel, where he says the Lakshman Rekha, once Sita has gone in the forest, when she crosses the Lakshman Rekha, she can go along with anyone. So, this stretch of imagination that we are talking about was changed from Valmiki to Tulsidas, and now you have Devdutt Patnaik interpreting it in this way. So, is this kind of allowable?
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Shokant Nepal.
Yes.
I have a question. The idea of the Hindu responsibility time, the idea of being Hindus responsibility time with India. What advice would you give non-Indian or people of non-Indian heritage, but who are Hindus? And how do we join this conversation?
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir. Your chance. Please be brief.
You will be surprised to know who I am. Let me tell you who I am.
No.
जो आप यहाँ पर सारा भाषण दे रहे हैं, मैं उसका भुक्तभोगी हूँ, मैं कश्मीरी पंडित हूँ। मैं सीधा ही कश्मीर से यहाँ आया हूँ। और आपको केवल ये बताने के लिए आया हूँ कि जो आपने बात यहाँ की है, आप मेरी बात सुनिए, हाथ जोड़ने की कोई जरूरत नहीं। ये आपने 30 साल पहले जोड़ना था। अगर आपने 30 साल पहले जोड़ा होता, मुझे यहाँ आने की जरूरत नहीं होती। मैं कश्मीर में वो लड़ाई लड़ता जिसकी बात उन्होंने की है। उस समय सारा देश ही नहीं, सारी दुनिया चुप करके बैठी थी, मुंह पे ताले लगे हुए थे। क्यों? क्योंकि मैं हिंदू था। और मैंने क्या किया ये मैं आपको बताऊंगा।
नहीं सर,
सिर्फ 1 मिनट सुनिए।
नहीं
जो आप यहाँ पर ये एक्टिविज्म कह रहे हैं, एक्टिविज्म को 1 मिनट सुनिए तो सही। एक्टिविज्म को डॉक्यूमेंट में बदलिए। मैं बॉडी